My name is Hannah. I'm 34 years old, a pediatric nurse living in Atlanta, Georgia. People often say I'm too forgiving, and maybe they're right, because even at my father's funeral, the day I should have been mourning, I was blindsided by a humiliation so cruel it left me trembling at the altar of his casket. I can still hear her voice. My stepmother, Carla, standing tall in her black designer dress, sneering loud enough for everyone to hear. "Don't cry too much, Hannah. You barely mattered to him anyway." The whispers rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. And there I was, his only daughter, left exposed, mocked, and stripped of dignity in front of my entire family. But what she didn't know was that grief can turn into fire, and that fire, I would use it to burn her world down, piece by piece. If you're hearing this, thank you for being here with me. Please like and subscribe. It truly means more than you know. And tell me, have you ever been humiliated by someone who should have lifted you? Betrayed at your most vulnerable moment? Let me know in the comments. I read them all, and it helps knowing we're not alone in these kinds of battles. Also, let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing the places these stories reach. Now, let me take you back. Because to understand why Carla humiliated me on the day of my father's funeral, you need to know how she came into our lives, and how she slowly poisoned everything. I grew up an only child. My mom passed away when I was just 10. My father, Daniel, was everything to me, strong, hardworking, but tender in ways people didn't often see. He used to pack my lunches with silly notes written on napkins. He sat through every school play, even the bad ones. He was my anchor, my safe place, but anchors rust. And after years of loneliness, my father remarried. That's when Carla entered the picture. She was younger than Dad, glamorous, the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. At first, I wanted to like her, for Dad's sake. He deserved companionship after losing Mom. But from the very beginning, I felt the chill in her smile. "Hannah," she said the first time we met, her eyes flicking over my simple clothes, my bitten nails. "So, you're the daughter." Just like that. Not his daughter, not Daniel's pride. Just the daughter. I should have trusted my instincts then, but I was too forgiving, too eager to keep the peace. Over the years, her claws sank deeper into our lives. She redecorated the house, erasing Mom's memory one photo frame at a time. She took over holidays, traditions, and even convinced Dad to change the will for simplicity. And me? I was slowly pushed to the sidelines. At Christmas, she'd hand out expensive gifts to her friends, while mine were token gestures. Cheap perfume, a scarf I'd never wear. At family gatherings, she'd speak for my father, answering questions he should have answered himself. And every time I tried to bond with him, she was there. Smiling, watching, making sure he never gave too much of himself back to me. But I held my tongue. For Dad. Always for Dad. And then came the funeral. A gray February morning. The church was heavy with the smell of lilies and damp wool coats. My hands trembled as I clutched the folded eulogy I'd written the night before. Words I hoped would honor him, even through my grief. I was standing at the front, my voice breaking as I spoke about his kindness, his sacrifices, the way he always made me feel like I was enough. When I returned to my seat, tears streaming, Carla leaned in, her perfume sharp, her words sharper. "Save your theatrics, Hannah. Everyone knows he cared more about me than he ever did about you." Her words sliced through me like glass. I gasped, pulling back, but she wasn't done. She raised her chin and spoke louder, her voice carrying to the rows behind us. "Honestly, don't make a fool of yourself. You were never the center of his world. I was." The church went silent. Heads turned. My cousins stared. Even the pastor paused, his mouth opening, then closing again. And me? I sat frozen, humiliated, my grief twisted into shame before the eyes of my entire family. That moment broke something in me, but it also lit the fuse, because humiliation has a way of clearing the fog. In that silence, I realized Carla wasn't just cruel. She was reckless. She had underestimated me, and from that day forward, I swore I would make her regret it. Not with screams, not with fists, but with the kind of revenge that strikes so quietly, so perfectly, it leaves your enemy stunned into silence. Just like she had left me. Before Carla, it was just Dad and me. Our world wasn't perfect, but it was ours. After Mom passed, he did everything he could to hold me together while holding himself together, too. He'd work long shifts at the hospital. He was an EMT, and still come home with enough energy to ask about my day. He cooked scrambled eggs for dinner more often than I can count. He'd mess them up, half burnt on one side, but he'd grin and say, "See, hon? A little crispy makes it better." And when nights felt too heavy, when the house was too quiet without Mom, we'd sit on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching fireflies. He'd squeeze my hand and whisper, "It's you and me, kid. Always you and me." That's the man I wanted to remember at his funeral. That's the man Carla mocked with her venom. The first time Dad introduced me to her, I felt my stomach sink. We were at a restaurant, one of those trendy places with tiny plates and overpriced salads. Carla walked in like she owned the room. Perfect hair, perfect nails, perfect everything. She leaned over to kiss Dad on the cheek, then turned to me with that polite, assessing smile people use when they're already judging you. "So you're Hannah," she said smoothly, her voice like honey with a hint of ice. "Your father talks about you all the time." I forced a smile. "Nice to meet you." She tilted her head. "You look different from what I expected." Different. That word lodged in my chest like a thorn. Dad, oblivious, laughed it off. "She's just nervous, hon. Don't take it personally." But I did. And I should have listened to that first instinct. It didn't take long for Carla to weave herself into our lives. She had a way of filling space, of taking control without ever raising her voice. One week, she was helping. Dad organized the bills. Next, she was redecorating the living room. Soon, Mom's photos came down. First from the mantel, then from the hallway, then from my own room. I remember walking in one afternoon to find her sliding a box of my mother's things into the attic. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharp. She didn't flinch. "Your father deserves a fresh start. These just keep him stuck in the past." "They're memories," I snapped. "They're clutter," she corrected, brushing past me. And when I told Dad, his face softened with guilt, but he shook his head. "She's just trying to make the house feel like a home again." But it was my home, and I could feel her erasing me, piece by piece, along with my mom. Carla was clever. She never attacked outright, at least not when Dad was looking. Instead, it was the little things. If I helped set the table, she'd glance at the forks and murmur, "Not how I would have done it." If I wore one of Mom's old sweaters, she'd smile thinly and say, "That color doesn't flatter you." If I mentioned applying to nursing school, she'd tilt her head. Ambitious. "But are you sure you can handle it?" Always small, always subtle, but sharp enough to draw blood. And Dad never noticed. Or maybe he chose not to. The first holiday with her was the clearest sign of what was coming. Thanksgiving used to be sacred. Dad and I cooking together, burning the turkey one year and laughing until we cried, making Mom's pecan pie recipe. No matter how badly we messed it up. But that year, Carla took over completely. She planned the menu, hired a caterer, and when I walked into the kitchen to help, she blocked the counter with her body. "Why don't you go set the kids' table?" "Hannah," she said smoothly, "the adults have this covered. I was 24. Not a child, but I did as she asked. biting my lip until I tasted blood. That night, Dad raised a toast to Carla's hard work, his eyes glowing with pride. And mine? They stung with tears I refused to shed at the table. Over the years, Carla's grip tightened. She managed Dad's appointments, his medications, and his accounts. She charmed the extended family, painting herself as the devoted wife who had rescued him from loneliness. And me? I became a background character. At reunions, she'd introduce me with a casual wave. "Oh, this is Hannah, Daniel's daughter. She's busy with work. Busy, forgettable, secondary." I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that Dad and I still had our porch talks, our inside jokes. But those became fewer too, drowned out by Carla's constant presence. And deep down, I started to wonder, was she right? Had I already lost my place in his world? But nothing compared to the months leading up to his death. Dad got sick, a sudden decline, faster than anyone expected. And in those fragile weeks, Carla tightened her control completely. She screened visitors, managed the doctors, and even dictated who could sit at his bedside. "Don't exhaust him, Hannah," she'd snap when I tried to talk to him. "He needs rest, not chatter." I wanted to scream, "He's my father." But I swallowed the words, too forgiving, too afraid of making things worse. And then, he was gone. Just like that. My anchor. My safe place. The one person who had always made me feel like enough, and in the cruelest twist of all, Carla took even that moment, his funeral, and used it to humiliate me in front of everyone. That's the truth about betrayal. It doesn't come all at once. It's not always a dramatic strike. Sometimes, it's death by 1,000 cuts. Until one day, the final blow leaves you bleeding on the church floor. But what Carla didn't realize, she had underestimated the daughter who had been silent for too long, and my silence was about to end. At first, Carla's cruelty hid behind a smile. She was too smart to lash out in front of my father. Around him, she was syrupy sweet, rubbing his shoulders, calling him darling, always positioning herself as the perfect wife. But when his back was turned, that's when her claws came out. I remember one Sunday afternoon, just months after they married. Dad was in the garage fixing a squeaky bike chain for a neighbor kid. Carla walked into the kitchen where I was pouring a glass of water. "You need to stop hanging on him so much," she said coolly, without even looking at me. I blinked. "What are you talking about?" "You act like you're still 10 years old. Always following him. Always needing his attention. It's pathetic." My throat went dry. "He's my dad. I like spending time with him." She finally turned, her smile thin. "Well, he has me now. Maybe you should start acting like an adult and step aside." Before I could respond, Dad walked in, grease on his hands. Carla's smile snapped back into place like a mask. "Honey, I was just telling Hannah how wonderful you are with kids." And Dad, none the wiser, just chuckled. "She's right about that, huh, hon?" I forced a smile, but inside, I burned. That became Carla's pattern. Little barbs disguised as advice. If I wore my mother's old necklace, she'd say, "Some people cling too hard to the past. It's unhealthy." If Dad bragged about my grades, she'd roll her eyes. "School is fine, but book smarts don't always translate to the real world." And if I dared to push back, she'd tilt her head and say, "Relax, Hannah. Don't be so sensitive." Those words cut deeper than anything else. Because they made me doubt myself. Was I being too sensitive? Was I imagining the hostility? I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe my father's second wife was just misunderstood, but deep down, I knew better. The first time she humiliated me publicly was at Thanksgiving. The house was full, cousins, uncles, neighbors, all buzzing around the long dining table. Carla had planned everything, from the floral centerpieces to the exact seating chart. She put me at the far end of the table, sandwiched between two distant relatives I barely knew. She sat herself right next to Dad, her manicured hand never leaving his arm. Halfway through dinner, Dad stood to make a toast. He raised his glass and said, "I'm so grateful for this family, and for my daughter, Hannah. She's the best thing I've ever done in my life." I felt my cheeks warm, my heart swell. For a moment, I had him back. Then Carla's laugh cut through the air. "Oh, Daniel," she said loudly, patting his arm. "You're too modest. We all know I'm the best thing that ever happened to you." The table chuckled politely. Some people looked away. My face burned. Dad kissed her cheek, chuckling too. "Well, I guess I'm lucky to have both." And just like that, the moment was stolen. My father's love, reduced to a punchline. That wasn't the only time. At family gatherings, she'd correct the way I spoke. "Don't say ain't, Hannah, it sounds trashy." At church, she once told the pastor's wife within earshot, "Poor Hannah, she tries, but she'll never have her mother's grace." Each comment was small enough to dismiss as just a joke. But each one chipped away at me until I started dreading being in the same room with her. The worst part? She was winning. Slowly, I felt my father slipping away. He still loved me. I knew that. But Carla's constant presence, her constant whispering in his ear, changed things. When I called him to ask for advice about nursing school applications, she'd answer first. "He's resting, Hannah. I'll pass along the message." When I tried to schedule dinner, she'd sigh. "Daniel's busy that night. Maybe another time." And when I confronted Dad, he just looked tired. "She's just protecting me, hon. You know she means well." But I knew better. She didn't want to protect him. She wanted to isolate me. By the time Dad got sick, Carla's power was absolute. She managed every detail. The doctors, the medications, the visitors. She decided who could sit by his bed and for how long. And me? His only daughter? I was treated like a stranger. 10 minutes, Hannah," she'd say firmly, her hand on the doorframe. "He needs his rest." I'd sit by his side, clutching his hand, whispering that I loved him, trying to memorize his face in those fragile moments. And every time, I could feel Carla's eyes on me, watching, policing, making sure I never got too much. Looking back, the humiliation at the funeral wasn't sudden. It was the final act of a play she had been directing for years. Carla had been chipping away at my place in my father's life since the day she arrived. And at his funeral, when she sneered that I barely mattered to him, it was just her, saying out loud what she had been trying to make everyone believe all along. But she made one mistake. She underestimated how far I was willing to go when pushed to the edge. And in the weeks after that funeral, my grief hardened into something she never saw coming. Determination. The morning of my father's funeral was gray and heavy, as if the sky itself was grieving. The church smelled of lilies and candle wax, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes long after you leave. I wore a black dress my mom had bought me years ago, one of the few things I had left of her. My hands shook as I clutched the folded eulogy I'd written, words I'd rewritten a dozen times the night before, words I hoped would honor him, even through my pain. When I walked into the sanctuary, every head turned. Cousins, old neighbors, Dad's co-workers, all watching me, waiting to see how the only daughter would hold herself together. And right there at the front sat Carla, draped in a sleek black gown, pearls gleaming at her throat, dabbing her eyes. With a tissue like she was the star of some tragic play. I tried to ignore her. I focused on my father's casket, on the framed photo of him smiling in his EMT uniform. That was my dad, strong, steady, always ready to save someone else. When the pastor called me up to speak, my knees nearly buckled. I took a deep breath and stepped to the podium. My voice trembled at first, but as I spoke about Dad's kindness, his sacrifices, the way he raised me after Mom died, something inside me steadied. "He always told me," I said, pausing to swallow the lump in my throat, "that it was us against the world, and no matter how hard life got, he made sure I never felt alone." The words cracked as they left me. Tears blurred my vision, but I pressed on. When I finally stepped down, the church was silent, heavy with grief. I thought I'd done him proud. But then Carla leaned close. She didn't whisper. She didn't hide it. She spoke loud enough for the pews behind us to hear. "Don't cry too much, Hannah," she sneered, her lips curling into a smile. "You barely mattered to him anyway." My breath caught. My head whipped toward her, but she wasn't done. Her voice rose, clear and deliberate. "Everyone knows I was the one he loved most, not you." The air shifted. Gasps rippled through the church. My aunt's hand flew to her mouth. My cousin's eyes went wide. Even the pastor faltered mid-step, as if he wasn't sure what to do. And me? I froze. My cheeks burned. My throat tightened, and all I could hear was the echo of her words bouncing off the stained glass windows. "You barely mattered." I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand and shout the truth. That I was his daughter, his only child. The one he stayed up with through fevers. The one he taught to ride a bike. The one he whispered, "Always you and me," to on the porch. But my voice wouldn't come. I sat there, humiliated, tears streaming down my face as the people who had come to honor my father now stared at me with pity. Carla had taken my grief, raw, aching, sacred, and twisted it into a spectacle. And I let her. After the service, people avoided my eyes. Some hugged me quickly, murmuring condolences, but their glances slid toward Carla, who stood tall and regal, shaking hands like the queen of the family. One relative whispered, "Stay strong, Hannah," and I knew what they really meant. Don't make a scene. So I didn't. I slipped out quietly, my hands trembling, my stomach in knots. By the time I reached my car, I collapsed against the steering wheel, sobbing so hard my chest ached. That was the breaking moment. Not just because of what she said, but because of where she said it. My father's funeral, the one place I should have been safe in my grief, the one place his memory should have been sacred, and she had defiled it. That night, I lay awake replaying every moment. Her smirk, the gasps, the way my own voice had failed me. The humiliation burrowed into my bones, deeper than any insult she'd ever thrown before. But beneath the pain, something else stirred. A spark. Because humiliation can break you. Or it can set you on fire. And as I stared at the ceiling in the dark, I swore I would never let her silence me again. I would take back my voice, and I would make sure Carla regretted every word she had ever spoken to me. The days after my father's funeral were a blur. I went back to work at the pediatric ward, but I wasn't really there. I smiled at parents, checked vitals, handed out medications, but inside I was numb. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Carla's voice echoing through that church. "You barely mattered to him anyway." It replayed like a curse. Over and over, until I started to wonder if maybe everyone else believed it too. The humiliation lingered in small ways. My cousin stopped returning my texts. My aunt's voice on the phone was clipped, almost awkward, like she didn't know how to talk to me anymore. And then there were the whispers. I heard them at the grocery store, in the church parking lot, and even in the hospital cafeteria. "Did you hear what happened at Daniel's funeral? Poor Hannah, but maybe Carla's right?" Each rumor was another dagger. I wasn't just grieving my father. I was fighting to hold on to the truth of who I was to him. and Carla had poisoned even that. One evening, about a week later, I drove to Dad's house, the home I grew up in. The lights were on, shadows moving behind the curtains. Carla's house now. I sat in the driveway, my chest heavy. I wanted to walk in, to sit in my old room, to breathe in the scent of him still lingering in the walls. But I knew what would happen. Carla would be there, standing in the doorway, arms crossed, smirking. "You don't belong here anymore, Hannah." So I turned the car around and drove away. That was the moment it hit me. I had lost not just my father, but my home. The breaking point came the following Sunday. I tried going back to church, hoping for comfort, for some sense of community. But when I walked in, the whispers started again. People glanced at me, then quickly looked away. One woman, someone who had known me since I was a child, leaned toward her friend and said just loud enough for me to hear, "It's a shame, really. Carla always did so much for Daniel. Poor girl doesn't realize her father moved on." I froze. My face burned, and then I walked right back out. I sat in my car in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. Tears blurred my vision, hot and relentless. That was it. That was the moment I truly broke. Not just because of Carla's words, but because of the way people believed her. Carla hadn't just humiliated me. She had rewritten the story of my father's love, and people were buying it. For days after, I spiraled. I stopped answering calls. I skipped meals. I sat on my couch at night, staring at old photos of Dad, whispering, "Did I matter to you? Please, tell me I mattered." My apartment felt too quiet, too heavy. I started doubting myself in ways I never had before. Maybe I had been too needy. Maybe Carla was right. Maybe I really wasn't the center of his world. But then, I found something. It was late one night. I was digging through a box of old things I'd taken from Dad's house before Carla moved in. Inside, tucked between some books, I found a stack of letters. They were from him. Notes he'd left me in high school, silly reminders like, "Good luck on your math test. You've got this." Or, "Don't forget you're stronger than you think." And at the very bottom, a card he'd written for my nursing school acceptance. His handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. "Hannah, you are the best part of my life. Your mother would be proud. I am proud. Always." I clutched that card to my chest and sobbed, because in that moment, I remembered the truth. Carla could twist, lie, humiliate, but she couldn't rewrite who I was to my father. I mattered, more than anything. And that's when despair shifted into something else. Determination. I wasn't going to let her story be the one people believed. I wasn't going to let her erase me the way she erased my mom's memory. If Carla thought she had silenced me, she was wrong, because grief had lit a fire inside me, and I was going to use that fire to expose her. Once the tears dried and the silence settled, I knew one thing for certain. Carla thought she had won. She thought the humiliation at the funeral was her final word, that she had rewritten my father's story, turned the family against me, and locked me in a corner I'd never crawl out of. But she underestimated me, because grief had burned away my fear, and in its place, it left clarity. I started by asking myself, what mattered most to Carla? The answer came quickly. It wasn't love, it wasn't family, it wasn't even my father. It was reputation. Carla fed on appearances. She needed people to see her as the perfect widow, the devoted stepmother, the woman who rescued my dad after Mom died. Every inch of her identity was built on that lie. So if I was going to strike, that's where I had to aim. Her image. Step 1 was gathering. I pulled out the shoebox where I'd been keeping Dad's old notes, cards, and photos, every piece of proof that showed who he really was to me. But I didn't stop there. I started making calls. Quietly. Carefully. To old family friends. To Dad's co-workers. To the neighbors who had seen us together over the years. "Do you remember how my dad used to come to my recitals?" I'd ask. "Do you remember how he bragged about me getting into nursing school? Do you remember him saying it was always him and me?" And you know what? They did. One by one, people shared stories. Stories of Dad showing up for me. Stories of his pride. Stories that made it clear I wasn't some forgotten child in the background. I wrote them all down, compiling them into a file. It wasn't just memories anymore. It was evidence. Step 2 was watching. Carla might have been smug, but she wasn't careful. I started noticing the cracks she tried to hide. The overdue bills were stacked on the counter of Dad's house when I stopped by to pick up some boxes. The whispered phone calls. I overheard when she didn't know I was in the room. The sharp edge in her voice when relatives asked about Dad's estate. I realized something. She wasn't as in control as she wanted everyone to believe. Money was tighter than she let on. The estate wasn't as secure as she pretended. And she was scrambling financially, her perfect widow facade was already starting to slip. Step 3 was preparing my stage. I didn't want a shouting match. I didn't want to stoop to her level and scream in public. No. I wanted precision. I wanted the entire family, the same people who watched me humiliated in church, to see the truth for themselves. So I planned a gathering. Not just any gathering, but a memorial dinner in Dad's honor. I booked the community hall where he'd once hosted holiday toy drives. I invited everyone, relatives, co-workers, neighbors, and I made it clear this was about celebrating my father's life. Carla couldn't resist. She thrived on being center stage. Of course, she RSVP'd immediately, probably imagining the night as another opportunity to flaunt her control. What she didn't know was that I was building the perfect trap. Step 4 was sharpening my tools. I gathered photos, letters, and testimonies. I printed out the stories people had shared with me, written proof of how Dad had bragged about me, leaned on me, loved me. And I found something even more powerful. At the bottom of that shoebox, hidden under old report cards, was a sealed envelope. My heart stopped when I saw his handwriting on the front. To Hannah, in case I'm not here. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter, dated just months before his death. "Hannah, if you're reading this, I want you to know something. Carla may try to change the story, but don't ever doubt it. You are my heart. You've always been my reason. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Tears streamed down my face as I read it. It wasn't just evidence. It was his voice, reaching through time, handing me the weapon I needed. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by papers, letters, and photos. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel powerless. I felt ready. Carla thought she could bury me with shame, but I was about to bury her with truth. And when the night of that memorial came, she wouldn't just lose control, she'd lose her silence. Once I had my plan, I couldn't just wait for the memorial dinner. I needed to test the waters, to chip away at Carla's mask and watch it crack. So I started small. The first chance came when I stopped by Dad's house to collect some of my things. Carla met me at the door, arms crossed, her voice sharp. "You can't just barge in whenever you feel like it." I held her gaze, calm. "The lawyer said I have every right to Dad's personal belongings, unless you'd like me to call him right now." Her jaw tightened. She opened her mouth, then closed. Finally, with a sharp huff, she stepped aside. It was the first time she didn't have the final word. And God, it felt good. Inside, I took my time. I walked through each room deliberately, not just gathering boxes, but studying her reactions. Every photo of Mom that had been hidden away, Every corner she had redecorated. I made notes. When I found one of Dad's old watches tucked carelessly in a drawer, I slipped it into my bag. Carla hovered nearby, fuming. "You're making a mess." Smiled sweetly. "Funny, that's exactly what you said at the funeral." Her face drained of color. She turned on her heel and stormed off. Small win. The second strike was even better. I arranged to have coffee with one of Dad's old co-workers, a man named Bill, who had known him for over 20 years. We sat at a cafe, sipping bitter coffee, sharing memories. "She's been telling people I barely mattered to him," I admitted, my voice low. Bill's eyes widened. "That's ridiculous. Dan adored you. He talked about you every shift, bragged about your nursing program, said you were the reason he kept pushing through the long nights." I swallowed hard. Would you be willing to say that publicly? At the memorial?" He didn't hesitate. Of course. Dan would want the truth out there. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Word started to spread quietly. Not from me, but from the people I confided in. At church, I overheard two women whispering, "Hannah's planning something for Daniel's memorial. I think she's going to speak." Carla must have heard it too, because the next day she called me out of the blue. Her voice was dripping with sugar. "Hannah, darling, I hear you're planning some kind of event? You know, people are still grieving. It might be better to let things rest." I let the silence stretch, then said evenly, "I think Dad deserves to be remembered properly, don't you?" For once, she didn't have a snide comeback. She just clicked her tongue and hung up, another crack in her armor. The third win came by accident. I stopped by the grocery store one evening, and who did I see in the next aisle but Carla, standing there arguing with the cashier about her declined card. She was flustered, snapping about bank errors while fumbling for another card. People in line whispered, glancing at each other. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, basket in hand, watching. When she finally noticed me, her face went pale. I smiled. "Everything all right?" She glared at me, tossed a bill on the counter, and stormed out. And just like that, I knew what I suspected was true. Her finances were crumbling. She was trying to keep up appearances, but the cracks were spreading faster than she could cover them. Back at home, I laid everything out on the table. Dad's letters, the testimonies from friends, the stories written down in neat pages, and at the top of the pile, that sealed letter he'd written me. "You are my heart. Don't let anyone take that away." Ran my fingers over his handwriting and whispered, "Don't worry, Dad. I won't." These small victories didn't erase the humiliation of the funeral. I still woke up some nights hearing Carla's voice in my head, but each win reminded me that she wasn't untouchable. Every time she faltered, every time she failed to respond, I felt stronger. And I realized something. Carla's greatest weapon had always been control over Dad, over the house, over the family narrative. But now, she was losing it, piece by piece. And soon, at the memorial dinner, I'd take it all. The night of the memorial dinner arrived like a storm. The community hall buzzed with voices as people filed in. Family, old friends, neighbors, Dad's co-workers. Tables were covered in white cloths, flickering candles, and framed photos of Dad, in his EMT uniform, holding me as a baby, smiling on our porch. Carla walked in last, of course, draped in black silk, diamonds glittering at her ears, chin high, as though she owned the room. "Such a lovely idea," she cooed to the crowd. "Daniel would be so proud." Her voice was sweet, but when her eyes met mine across the room, the sweetness curdled into venom. This was her stage. She thought she'd control the narrative. Again. But tonight, the script was mine. The dinner began with polite chatter, plates of food, and Carla floating from table to table, soaking in the sympathy. Finally, I stood at the front of the room, microphone in hand. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady. Thank you all for coming tonight. My father loved this community, and I wanted us to have a chance to honor him together. Carla sat near the front, legs crossed, her smile sharp, as if daring me to falter. But I didn't. I began with stories, small ones. How Dad taught me to ride a bike, how he used to burn scrambled eggs, how he once stayed up all night helping me finish a science project. People chuckled softly, nodding. Then I paused, letting the silence settle. There's been some talk, I said slowly, scanning the crowd. That I wasn't important to him, that maybe I barely mattered. Gasps. Heads turned toward Carla. She stiffened, her smile faltering. I held up a stack of papers. But I think it's time you all heard the truth. Not from me, but from him, and from those who knew him best. I read the first letter, a note Dad had left me before a big exam. No matter what happens, you've already made me proud. Then, another from my nursing school acceptance. Hannah, you are the best part of my life. My voice shook, but I pressed on. These aren't just words. This is proof. Proof that I was not some forgotten child. I was his daughter. His pride. I gestured toward the audience. And don't just take my word for it. Bill, would you stand? Bill rose from his seat, clearing his throat. I worked with Daniel for 20 years. Every single shift he bragged about Hannah. Said she was the reason he kept pushing through long nights. If you think she didn't matter to him, you didn't know Daniel at all. Murmurs rippled through the room. Carla's face flushed red. I pulled out the final envelope, the one Dad had written, "In case I'm not here." My hands trembled as I opened it, but my voice was clear. Hannah, you are my heart. You've always been my reason. Don't let anyone take that away from you. The room was silent. You could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Then someone sniffled. Another whispered, "My God." And all at once, the silence turned into a wave of whispers, gasps, nods. People leaned toward me, not Carla. The tide had shifted. Carla stood suddenly, her chair scraping the floor. "This is manipulation," she snapped, her voice high, brittle. "You think a few scraps of paper prove anything? Daniel loved me. Everyone knows that." But her voice cracked, and the crowd didn't look at her with admiration anymore. They looked at her with pity, with suspicion. My aunt folded her arms. "Funny, Carla, I don't remember you at the recitals, or the graduations. But I do remember Hannah's father showing up every single time." Others nodded. Whispers grew louder. Carla's face twisted. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, she had no words. I looked right at her, steady. "You humiliated me at his funeral. You tried to erase me. But the truth is simple. I was his daughter, his only child, his heart. And nothing you say will ever change that." Carla's eyes darted around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. But no one did. She grabbed her purse, muttered something about not needing this circus, and stormed out. The door slammed, and just like that, she was gone. The rest of the evening felt lighter. People came up to hug me, to share their own memories of Dad, to tell me how proud he would be. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel humiliated. I felt seen, and I knew, deep in my bones, that my father's memory was safe. Because I had defended it. Carla had lost her audience. And I had finally reclaimed my voice. The night of the memorial dinner ended with laughter. Not the mocking laughter I'd endured at the funeral, but warm, genuine laughter. Cousins sharing stories about Dad, neighbors remembering his jokes, co-workers clapping me on the back as they told me how proud he always was of me. For the first time in months, I felt light. like I could finally breathe again. Carla's absence was a silence that nobody missed. In the weeks that followed, the whispers changed. At the grocery store, instead of hearing, "Poor Hannah," I heard, "Did you know Daniel wrote her letters?" What a devoted father. At church, people stopped avoiding me. They leaned in, hugged me, and told me how brave I'd been to share my truth. And Carla? Her name became a shadow. Neighbors told me they saw less and less of her. She stopped attending gatherings, stopped holding her head high. Some said she'd been embarrassed into hiding. Others whispered her finances were unraveling without Dad to manage the stability. Whatever the reason, she wasn't the star anymore. She was a ghost, and that, more than anything, was my victory. But the biggest shift came within the family itself. My aunt called me one evening, her voice heavy with regret. "Hannah, I should have spoken up at the funeral. I knew Carla was wrong, but I stayed silent. I'm sorry." I swallowed hard. "It hurt," I admitted. "But I understand. She had everyone under her thumb." She sighed. "Not anymore. You showed us the truth, and we're with you now." It wasn't just words. Over the next few weeks, relatives who had once looked at me with pity now looked at me with pride. They invited me back into the fold, not as the humiliated daughter, but as the rightful heir to my father's memory. Still, the aftermath wasn't all easy. There were nights I woke up in a cold sweat, replaying the funeral in my mind. Carla's voice echoing through the church. There were moments at work when I found myself zoning out, gripping my pen too tightly, as though bracing for another humiliation. Trauma doesn't vanish overnight. It lingers, whispering doubts, even when the truth is clear. But every time that doubt crept in, I reached for Dad's final letter. "You are my heart. Don't let anyone take that away from you." I carried it in my bag everywhere I went, like armor. And slowly, the voice in my head shifted. Carla's venom grew faint. My father's words grew louder. One day, I drove past the house I grew up in. The yard was overgrown, weeds curling around the porch steps. The curtains were drawn, the driveway empty. For years, that house had felt like a battlefield, a place Carla had ruled while she erased my mother's memory, while she tried to erase me. But now, it just looked hollow. Carla's kingdom had rotted from the inside out. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. I felt peace. Because the house might have been hers, but the legacy was mine. Even my relationship with my father shifted in the aftermath. Not literally. He was gone, and nothing could change that. But the way I carried him changed. I no longer saw him through the lens Carla had tried to force on me. I no longer doubted whether I mattered to him, because I had the proof, the letters, the stories, the memories. All of it painted the truth. He loved me. I was his heart, and no one, not even Carla, could take that from me again. One evening, months after the dinner, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, the sun setting in streaks of orange and pink. I closed my eyes and imagined him there beside me, the way he used to sit, squeezing my hand and whispering, "It's you and me, kid." And for the first time since he died, I whispered back without crying, "It's still us, Dad. Always." That's the thing about aftermath. It doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't undo the betrayal, but it reshapes it. Carla's words at the funeral used to haunt me. Now they don't, because I know the truth. And so does everyone else. She tried to humiliate me, to silence me, to make me doubt my worth. But in the end, she only revealed her own emptiness. Sometimes I think back to that day at the church, the gray sky, the lilies, Carla's voice cutting me open in front of everyone. For a long time, I thought that moment defined me. That humiliation would be the story people remembered when they thought of my father's funeral. But I was wrong, because now when people talk about my father, they don't mention Carla's cruelty. They mention his letters, his love, his pride in me. I reclaimed the story, and in doing so, I reclaimed myself. Here's the truth I learned. Humiliation doesn't have to be the ending. It can be the beginning. Carla tried to strip me of dignity. Instead, she stripped herself of credibility. She thought her words would silence me. Instead, they sharpened mine. And the cruel irony? The very stage she used to break me, my father's funeral, became the stage where I found my strength. Because I stood again, months later, at that memorial dinner. And this time, my voice didn't shake. Revenge, I realized, isn't always about shouting louder than the person who hurt you. Sometimes, it's about waiting, gathering, choosing the perfect moment to let the truth speak for itself. Carla's downfall didn't come from me screaming at her. It came from me holding up my father's words, from me refusing to be erased, and when the truth came out, she had nothing left. No audience, no power, no control, just silence. Today, my life looks different. I still work as a nurse, still live in Atlanta, still carry the grief of losing my father. But that grief doesn't crush me anymore, because alongside it I carry his pride, his love, his words etched into every choice I make. You are my heart. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Carla couldn't take it. No one can. And that knowledge, that's my peace. And now, to you, listening to my story, maybe you've been humiliated too. Maybe you've been betrayed by someone who should have protected you. Maybe you've been made to feel small in front of others. I want you to hear me. Their words do not define you. Your truth does. Your resilience does. And the day will come when the same silence they tried to force on you will turn back on them. If you've stayed with me through this, thank you, truly. Please like and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing these stories with you. But more than that, I want to hear from you. Have you ever taken back your voice after someone tried to silence it? Have you ever turned humiliation into empowerment? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and let me know where you're watching from. It reminds me that even though betrayal can make us feel alone, we are part of something bigger. To my father, I mattered. I always did, and to anyone listening who doubts themselves right now, so do you.